Before we get to Alex Rodriguez's historic contract, though, we first need to make a detour into a very brief history of free agency in baseball. For most of the 20th century, as most baseball fans know, there was no free agency. Players were limited by the reserve clause. That meant a team reserved the rights to a player in perpetuity. If a player didn't like the salary he was offered, he could refuse to play or retire, but he couldn't entertain offers from other teams. This was, of course, merely a way to suppress player salaries, and it technically violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, but the Supreme Court granted baseball an exemption, first in 1922 and then again in 1953, stating that baseball was only an amusement and not interstate commerce.
We should mention, at least briefly, that the first player to mount a significant opposition to the reserve clause was Curt Flood, who in 1969 was traded from St. Louis to Philadelphia without his consent. And Flood's story, worth telling in its own right, probably deserves its own podcast, but the end result was that he lost his case, although he did help reorient Marvin Miller and the MLB Players Association towards trying to knock down the reserve clause for good.
The first hint at what might happen to player salaries in the absence of the reserve clause came in 1974, when Catfish Hunter's contract was avoided because the Athletics owner had failed to make an annuity payment. This made Hunter a free agent before the reserve clause came down. The Yankees quickly signed him to a 5-year, $3.5 million deal with a $1 million signing bonus, making him the highest paid player in baseball. Then in 1975, the reserve clause was finally struck down in a decision by arbitrator Peter Seitz over two players who had played the 75 season without a contract. Seitz ruled that this ended their obligation to the team, and they were now free to negotiate with any team that wanted them. The owners appealed the decision, but the courts upheld the ruling, and eventually Miller and the union negotiated a version of free agency to commence after the 1976 season.
When the arbitrator finally agreed with the union that an owner could only control a player for 1 year, the time had come to negotiate a whole new system, and the owners panicked. They could not picture living under a system in which every player would be a free agent every year.
Miller shrewdly offered the owners what seemed on the surface a compromise. Players would not be eligible for free agency until they had played 6 years. The owners gratefully agreed. At least they could still control their most valuable assets for a time. But baseball would never be the same again. The law of supply and demand now favored the players.
That first free agent class saw a bunch of big deals, led by Reggie Jackson, who signed a 5-year, $3 million deal with the Yankees. Salaries kept going up, exposing just how underpaid players had been under the reserve clause system. In 1979, Nolan Ryan became the first player to get over $1 million per year, signing with the Astros for 3 years and $3.5 million. A year later, Dave Winfield signed a mammoth 10-year deal that began with a $1.3 million salary, but included costs of living increases that ultimately made it worth about $23 million over 10 years. Here's Winfield and Jackson talking about what that was like.
Dave Winfield becomes the highest paid athlete in sports today.
There's only one problem with making the most money. When you're harnessed up and you're the team that pulls the cart, your fanny sticks up the highest, and you feel the whip more often, right?
That's right. And all eyes are on you.
You get whipped a little more often. But you can handle it. You got a big fanny.
Oh, yeah. I can handle it.
But then the salary growth basically just stopped. Going into the 1981 season, Winfield was the game's highest paid player, earning roughly $2.3 million per year, at least if you annualize his whole contract. And going into 1989, 8 years later, the highest paid player was made roughly $2.6 million a year. That's only a very slight increase over those 8 seasons. Because the 1980s were marked by collusion among owners to keep salaries down. They refused to bid against each other for players, and the commissioner, Peter Ueberroth, openly told owners not to offer players long-term deals, which effectively undid free agency. In 1985, for example, George Steinbrenner offered Carlton Fisk a contract, but then withdrew it days later when the owner of Fisk's old team, Jerry Reinsdorf, called him to complain. In 1986, average player salaries actually went down for the first time since free agency started. Teams even briefly shrunk roster sizes so that players had to compete for fewer jobs. Overall, the Players Association filed 3 different grievances against the owners during the 1980s, and they won all 3, and eventually settled for $280 million to give you a scale of the wage theft going on in the 80s. Then commissioner, the guy who replaced Ubroff, Fay Vincent, he told owners that they stole $280 million from players, and the players were deservedly pissed.
Yeah, the owners hated Vincent since he was a commissioner who seemed to care more about the sport than the wealth of the owners, which is a huge no-no for someone in that job. I feel like every 40 or so years, the owners hire a commissioner who just doesn't really get the role and actually likes baseball. This happened with Happy Chandler, who was potentially pushed out of the job for being too pro-player and too supportive of integration in the 40s and 50s. Anyway, Vincent was ran out of the job after just a few years.
And once the dust settled on the collusion scandal, player salary growth resumed. Going into the 1989 season, no player earned more than $3 million per year, but midway through 1990, Jose Canseco signed a deal worth $4.7 million per season over 5 years. Just a couple years later, Barry Bonds signed a 6-year deal with San Francisco that paid him nearly $7.3 million per season.
Then, two things happened in the mid-90s to take player salaries to another level. First, the owners' attempts to impose a salary cap failed when the players went on strike in 1994. You can see here the pattern of the owners' reaction to free agency. First, to collude, and then when they got caught doing that, they tried to impose a hard cap, provoking a labor fight. But the other thing that began in the mid-90s was the rise of the regional sports networks, or RSNs. RSNs are the cable channels that carry local sports teams' games. The first one started back in the 1970s, but it was only with the mass adoption of cable television that they really changed the business model of pro sports. Because before that, sports were basically a live events business. Sure, there was revenue in radio and merchandise and stuff, but for the most part, teams made money by selling tickets to games. Once you had channels willing to pay for the rights for all a team's games, that was a massive new source of revenue, and now suddenly teams were also in the cable TV business. So when the two sides reached a collective bargaining agreement after the 94-95 strike, there was so much new money pouring into the game that some of it was bound to make it to the players. And you can see this in the way the title of highest paid player in baseball kept getting reset. Before the 1996 season, Ken Griffey Jr. signed for $8.5 million per year. After that year, Albert Bell got up to $11 million. Then Barry Bonds passed Bell before spring training ended. After that season, Pedro Martinez got up to $12.5 million. Then a year later, Mike Piazza, Mo Vaughn, and Kevin Brown all passed him. Brown's deal, which was negotiated by Scott Boras, was a milestone. At $15 million over 7 years, he was the first guy to cross $100 million in total value. Man, Scott Boras is an incredible agent.
Really is.
He becomes the first $100 million player in baseball, and yes, the price of poker has gone up drastically. Just over 2 years ago, Albert Bell became the game's first $50 million player. There was an uproar then, but the money keeps flowing. Former A's GM Sandy Alderson, who's now working in the commissioner's office, called Brown's deal an affront to baseball.
To put all this in perspective, remember, going into the 1989 season, the highest paid player in baseball made $2.63 million per year. 10 years later, the highest paid guy made $15 million, almost 6 times as much. And that was the environment in which Alex Rodriguez found himself entering free agency. It was an amazing confluence of events. An unusually talented player who played an unusually high profile in an in-demand position, becoming a free agent at the unusually young age of 25 at a time of unprecedented growth in player salaries. Everybody knew A-Rod was going to reset the scale. The only question was where he would go and what the final number would be.